Now we turn to the second parable in Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. This is the parable of the talents, or the master and the three servants. As with most of Jesus' parables, and really with the whole Bible, there are many different ways that people interpret this parable. There isn't a single correct interpretation since there are so many different elements to any given text, and it's often valuable to consider multiple approaches. I'm going to share one possibility with you, and I'd like to back up as we do so and consider the frame in which Matthew sets these two parables. Matthew 25, verse 1 opens with the words, "At that time the kingdom of heaven will be like," and we're left wondering at what time. For this, we need to flip back over to chapter 24 to remember what precedes this parable, which is something I'd really encourage you to do whenever you can, anytime that you're going to pick up the Bible to read a passage. Think of it like you're creating your own recap. Anytime you're watching your favorite series on TV, they might say, "Previously on this show," and that's what we want to do, is make sure we know where what we're reading it comes in the context of the story. So take a look at what came right before the part that you're going to study, and keep in mind that you might also benefit from reviewing things that happened still earlier in the book that you're reading to better understand where your passage fits in. As I mentioned briefly in last week's study, in chapter 24, Jesus has just left the temple after his confrontation with the chief priests and the Pharisees. He goes alone up to the Mount of Olives, and then the disciples find him there and ask about what will happen at the end of the age. Jesus tells them that they will face trials and persecution, that they should be watchful and discerning. He makes reference to apocalyptic images from the original Testament, and he introduces the idea of uncertainty about when the crucial time will come, about being prepared and ready continually. And this is a theme that continues in chapter 25 with the parable of the bridesmaids. And I'd like to highlight a few details as we then consider the parable of the talents, or the three servants, that might help us imagine what Jesus is getting at when he tells this story. First, to make sure we are on more or less the same page, there's a little bit of room for variation and thinking about what it would be equal to at this point in history. But a talent is about 20 years worth of minimum wage. So this is an impossibly large amount of money for any average person to contemplate the idea of having on hand, simply in excess to invest. Since then, just as now, laborers need to spend most of their wages on the basic necessities of life, making sure they have food and clothing and shelter. The man in this story, the rich man who goes on his journey, has about 160 years worth then of minimum wage salary stored up that he doesn't need immediately, and he's just going to leave it behind while he travels. And not only that, but he's expecting this money to have grown enormously and see major profits when he comes back. So that's one thing to remember, that we're talking about really large amounts of money. Another thing to keep in mind is that as we read through this parable, we can see that the social hierarchy between the master and the servants is reinforced in the parable. Now, these aren't just any servants, it's true, since they're being left with the responsibility for such large sums of money. They must have some experience in business or working with him over the years, but they clearly have no choice in the matter. And if they had, I imagine the third servant would have opted out from the very beginning. We also want to take note of the fact that the master expects the servants to know how to make such enormous profits with his money. We don't know exactly how much time the master was gone for his long time on his long journey. Could have been months or possibly a couple of years, I guess. But he was gone for a long time. Still, he comes back to find his money doubled in most cases. And where did these servants learn how to make that much money, how to turn such a profit? It's not really clear. There are different possibilities. Perhaps they'd learned how to run the same business that the master was usually engaged in. But I'm left with that question of what sort of business could that really have been to make that kind of profit? which is clearly far superior to the amount that would have come from simply investing the money with the bankers and earning some interest from lending. And of course, we know that for the Jewish community, investing money with the bankers was frowned upon and contrary to Jewish teaching about charging interest, as we see in Leviticus chapter 25 and some other references from the Hebrew scriptures. So it was most likely some sort of not entirely ethical business endeavor that these servants were engaging in on behalf of their master while he was off on his trip. Another thing to remember is that the third servant recognizes the harshness of the master and identifies him as someone who reaps where he does not sow, which is to say, he benefits from the labor of others and gains profit from other people's work, which is not necessarily the most honorable thing to do. This servant also appears unwilling to engage in money lending, since he didn't choose to take the talent that he was left with to the bank. And so it seems like he's been condemned from the very start, because the only way to win in this scenario is to play by the master's rules, which, as we've been considering, might not be so honorable or upstanding. So if that's the case, what kind of joy would the master's happiness be about? I'm not sure that this represents the kind of joy that we're promised in living into the kingdom of heaven, for example. I don't know if a man who has such inordinate wealth and is eager to make more profit by any means is really the kind of person I want to be living the good life with, personally, as I consider this. So I'm not sure, but perhaps the third servant's choice is actually an honorable one. Another thing that I'd like to make note of, and this isn't necessarily a huge crucial detail, but it is a significant one and offers us some of this freedom to consider this parable differently, is that, we read it in English typically, and depending on what translation you're working with, Matthew 25, verse 14 might start off with the words, "The kingdom of heaven is like," but the original Greek does not have those words. In the Greek, this verse simply says, "It is like a man going on a journey who called his servants." So we can infer, since we've been kind of in this series of Jesus' speech, and he's just given a parable, that the kingdom of heaven is like this, with the 10 bridesmaids. But now, in the case of these three servants, it doesn't actually say that in the setup. It just continues on, but doesn't give us that context. So I think there's room to negotiate on that question of, are we still talking about something that the kingdom of heaven is like, or is this actually a contradictory vision to what the kingdom of heaven would really represent? So I leave those ideas with you. And again, we talked in the first parable's response about the fact that often we have the impulse when we read parables to identify one of the characters with God or with Jesus. And certainly people do so with this parable as well. But personally, I don't think it's the best idea to do that, especially if we're going to draw that comparison with the master for some of the reasons that I've just outlined. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts about this and would leave you with these reflection questions. How does this parable relate to the kingdom of heaven that Jesus has been announcing throughout the Gospel of Matthew? What do you think of the third servant? What might have motivated him to bury the talent instead of making another choice? What do you think Jesus wanted to communicate with this parable?